TYT Community here on the TYT Network, the show paneled by members and fans of the Young Turks. I am your host, Jeff Waldorf, and I am joined here by contributors, Jordan French, Stephen Buckley, and Sean Fitzgerald. Great to have you guys joining the panel, of course. Man, we've got a lot of fantastically great, awesome stories in order to get into. So we're going to get into that. We're going to talk about MSNBC first, how they are the least trusted in news. That's kind of an amazing story. Louis Gohmert, we're going to have a lot of fun with Louis Gohmert, man. The big news, Eric Cantor. We're going to talk a lot about Eric Cantor, and we're going to end up with, of course, Mark Levin saying something stupid on Hannity. That's going to be great. So let me start out, of course, with MSNBC and how they are now the least trusted name in news. Bad news for MSNBC. In a poll by the Brookings and Public Religion Research Institute, out of all cable news channels, MSNBC is identified as the most trusted news source by the fewest people. So let me break down some of the numbers in this poll. So among all Americans surveyed, only 5% of them identify MSNBC as their most trusted network. 17% view CNN as the most trusted network, and 23% of all Americans sampled believe that broadcast news is the most trusted. So finally, out of all Americans surveyed, a quarter of them say that they trust Fox News more than any other news source. Now, we'll talk about the problem with that later. But first I want to break this down by partisan lines. Now, obviously, Fox News is going to have conservatives and Republicans, which are distinctly separated in this study. They're going to have them as a higher percentage. 53% of Republicans and 48% of self-identified conservatives trust Fox News. Now, I don't think any of those numbers should surprise anyone. Now, for broadcast news, it's pretty evenly split between Democrats, Independents, Republicans, Conservatives, Moderates, and Liberals. Now, I have a chart for you here that I want to show. Now, if you guys can see that, of course, as you can see, Republicans obviously trust Fox News more. But look down at the bottom, MSNBC. Not even a lot of liberals trust MSNBC. Now, that's really, really interesting. You've got your CNN, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. More Democrats and more Americans trust Jon Stewart and The Daily Show than they trust MSNBC. Now, that's really, really, really fascinating. So there's the breakdown of who trusts who. So what does that mean when it comes to policy issues? Well, this study also had the example of how people view immigrants. Now, the two views presented were that immigrants either strengthened our country because of their work and talents, or they burdened America because they took our jobs, houses, and health care. So I'm going to focus on Republicans here because this is the most interesting part. Republicans that trust Fox News the most overwhelmingly see immigrants as a burden. They're taking our jobs. Obama's giving them freebies, so they'll vote for Democrats. You know, you guys ever notice how their only fear is about who somebody is going to vote for? Sort of like crazy homeschool expert that we covered before, who's afraid sex ed is going to create Democrats, and that's why sex ed is evil. Amazing. Anyway, 60% view immigrants as a burden, 33% that they strengthen our country. Okay, so that's among Fox News Republicans. Now, what about among Republicans that trust other news sources than Fox News? You know, like broadcast news and CNN. 56% of them said that immigrants strengthen our country. 38% said that they're a burden. Now, so wait a minute here. It's sort of the exact. It's almost the exact opposite. It's almost as if Fox News is pushing some sort of specific narrative. So I have my own thoughts about why MSNBC is in the tank. Now remember, according to this study, more people trust Jon Stewart of The Daily Show more than MSNBC. But before I get to that, I want to go to you, Stephen, and I want to ask you about this study.
Well, I mean, I think the scale of the numbers is the most surprising thing. But for me, the reason why Fox News is by far and away ahead of MSNBC, and we all know Fox News leans to the right heavily, and MSNBC leans to the left, more centrist. The problem is that Fox News, they're constantly telling their audience and anyone who is aware of Fox News that they're fair and balanced. Whereas MSNBC, that's not their tagline. I don't even know what MSNBC's tagline or driving philosophy is. Now, Fox News says that theirs is fair and balanced, so people may associate with that and say, well, I know they lean a bit right, but at least I know they're telling me the truth with a bit of a right slant. I don't know how people can computate that anyway. But with MSNBC, people instantly think, well, they're not saying that they're fair and balanced, and I know that they're part of the liberal media. They say that they're liberal. You've got people like Chris Hayes and Rachel Maddow who are, progressives, and oh no, they're nasty, sort of thing that people are thinking. So that's why people don't trust MSNBC News, because they don't come out and say, no, we're giving you the news direct. That they're open about what their project is at MSNBC, whereas Fox News isn't, and that's why I think numbers are so kind of far apart.
All right. Let's go to you, Sean.
Oh, well, I was gonna say the MSNBC tagline is "Lean Forward," but yeah, so that's not really fair and balanced, I guess. But really, this is about who's more knowable, because MSNBC, like, it's a network that very few people have ever heard of in this country. It hasn't been around, or hasn't been big around that long, and like Fox has more ratings, so it makes sense that more people would trust it. But there's one point that you made in your opening statement, Jeff, that it was Republicans that trust CNN and other news sources. They could be trusting conservative internet news sources. Like, it doesn't really specify that they trust CNN or anything. It's just that Fox News is more anti-immigrant than even like Glenn Beck's The Blaze, or it's more anti-immigrant than certain like popular right-wing online sites. They focus on other things. So, and also the Fox News audience is really, really old, right? And other conservative, like younger conservatives, gravitate toward other conservative news outlets, and like young people have more of association with immigrants. Like old people, if you're really, really old, the chances of you encountering or meeting new friends at school or all these different places where you meet immigrants is pretty unlikely. So like there's a couple reasons why the numbers break down the way they do. Most possibly low because MSNBC is terrible.
Well, there's some points that I want to address about why I think the numbers are. But first, I want Jordan to chime in here real quick. Jordan, go ahead.
I just want to repeat what Sean said without the ridiculous like accent or whatever that was. MSNBC's motto is "Lean Forward." They launched a really big, ambitious ad campaign about the same time that Jank had a show on MSNBC, which is why I know the motto, because I used to play that show in my hookah lounge whenever I owned one. But yeah, the whole... I'm not surprised by anything on here. I don't particularly trust MSNBC, and I am a liberal. I think Rachel Maddow is about the only person on the network that I get the impression of being, genuinely concerned about preaching truth from an admittedly progressive bias. I'm a public radio, broadcast person myself, and the reason why I like that is because public radio and public, PBS, NPR, in America at least, are the closest thing we have to a network, and they fail at this all the time too, don't get me wrong, but they're the closest thing we have to a network that doesn't treat issues like, doesn't treat all issues like they're inherently political, and that I went on a big rant on this today, and I had Stephen fact check me on my Facebook wall. But basically, NPR does a better job of like whenever something is a fact, like when they cover climate change, they don't have a climate denier on the panel, a scientist on the panel who's talking about climate change, and give them both equal time. They'll acknowledge that 3% of scientists say maybe climate change isn't quite what we've got it, what we think it is, and then they move on with the remaining 97% of the data. So MSNBC and Fox News just feed into this. This is a left issue. This is a right issue, and that you don't get news and then decide what you think. You get told what your position is at the same time the news is being presented to you. And CNN buys into that just as much by being arbitrarily down the middle. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all that people don't buy that. Now, obviously, Fox News's audience is a little bit older. They identify more, with their politics. That's a bigger part of who they are. And so that message is going to ring truer with that audience than it does with MSNBC's target audience that's not that old and doesn't, want to identify with I hate immigrants or I love immigrants, but is more willing to be a little more fluid in their identity.
Right. And
I'm not quite sure that I buy some of your arguments there, Jordan, because I think that there are some important points to consider, right? Especially like if you think about how Fox News is actually reacting to this news, and they're all like, "Oh my God, yes, we're the most trusted. We're obviously 100% right," and I don't think that that's the case at all, right? I think what's important to look at in order to prove that is to look at the demographics, right? Now, you guys both have alluded to it. The average age of the Fox News viewer is 68 years old, okay, and this is almost true of I think most of the cable news scene, cable news viewers. They are mostly older. Younger people are not watching television at nearly as much. There was a Pew report back in 2012 that mentioned that 71% of Americans aged 18 to 29 that coveted demo, they get their news from the internet, from people like us and from our network partners like the Young Turks and other online media, right? And so here's an interesting stat to go along with that. Half of people over 65 watch cable news regularly, right? They sit down for scheduled programming, where a lot of younger people, they don't have, nobody got time for that, right? So they get near news in smaller segments throughout the day. And guess what kind of helps with that? YouTube clips. Those are fantastic for that. So look, they're not, younger people are not watching as much TV, and I think this definitely feeds into that.
I also want to point out one thing that's in this study that's not in the other studies that we see from the media, is that this just says that the fewest people trust MSNBC the most. It doesn't say who they trust the least, because we've seen study after study where Fox News is the most trusted name in news, and it's also the least trusted name in news, because there's some people who view it very positively, and conversely, some people view it extremely negatively. So this just means that a smaller percentage of people watch MSNBC, and then it's a percentage of those people who trust it. It's not the same thing as saying that people hate it the most.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. But just going on what Jeff said, I recently presented at a conference, and I was talking about those specific figures about kind of the number of young people in the 18 to 24 demographic that are just accessing kind of the internet now for their news. And if you look at the trends in the graphs, it's just more kind of radio, newspaper, and TV. They're all dipping down, and the internet is going way up. And so, I don't know the specific viewing figures for kind of Fox Nation and kind of MSNBC.com, but if you look at their YouTube channels, their viewing figures are awful, so they are eventually going to die off. But with this study as well, to go back, I mean, I know in 2014 you've got the midterms, and for people like us, we find it interesting and important in many different ways, but for the vast majority of Americans, they don't care about it. If they did this poll in the start of 2016, kind of, I know, maybe around kind of May time, when you're really building up to the election, that's when all of the major networks receive a massive boost in viewing figures because people start caring about politics all of a sudden again. I think repeating this study again and then taking into effect, Sean's point about looking at kind of the most trusted and least trusted. I think they'll shift. I'd like to hope that they'd shift a fair substantial amount in who becomes most trusted, because if you look at the statistics of the amount of kind of the people who watch the cable news networks, as we said, they're all older, kind of average age 68 for Fox, for CNN and MSNBC, it's about 66 or around that mark. But the people who watch cable news networks compared to local news or kind of broadcast news, they spend nearly 3 times as long watching said news networks. So they'll spend kind of an average of 72. I think it's something like 72 minutes a day they'll spend watching the cable news networks. Whereas viewers who predominantly watch local news, they'll maybe watch 16 minutes. So the people who are watching these networks and find them kind of most trustworthy or least trustworthy, they're heavily entrenched. And so if they're going to be watching these networks for a lot, those who are watching Fox News, and there's a lot of people who do watch Fox News, they're going to want to think that they're watching the most trustworthy thing because they're spending so much time watching it. So I mean, I think these numbers will certainly shift when it becomes a more political time in the country. And whilst 2014 is important, 2016 is going to be more important.
All right,
right, and you've got people who sit there, and like you said, they're older, they've got more time, and they'll sit there and watch things. People like Hannity for an hour because they'll normally go for, since they have so much time invested, they're going to want to hear the things that they believe in, and they're going to want to hear more opinion commentary shows, and that's why you have Fox News being more trustworthy, because they're getting all of these opinions and they're like, yeah, I agree with that, kick all those immigrants out, yeah, you know what I mean? Whereas you don't really see as much of that. I mean, you still have a lot of opinion shows on MSNBC, but Fox News definitely holds the mantle because they've got much more of an audience, they've got much more spread, I guess, and they're a household name. All right, Sean, one more quick point and I'm going to close it out.
Oh yeah, and I was just going to say, it also just shows the success of the Fox News business model. Like every other thing, except for maybe the Daily Show on that list, to a certain extent is trying to be the middle ground news. And Fox is trying to feed conservatives red meat, essentially. Like MSNBC just, like in relatively recent history, became the quote-unquote liberal news outlet. So it's going to take them a while to build up that base. And what actually hurts them is that the president is a Democrat right now. Because if you're really a liberal, then you're not going to support like half the stuff that Obama's doing, and MSNBC a lot of the times is carrying the water for them. Like Melissa Harris Perry saying Edward Snowden should come home, like all this other stuff. So you're hurt that your guys in the White House, and you're hurt that Fox has had a head start on everybody. They've been doing this for 20 years, where they're going after that one section of the audience to feed them what they want.
Right. And to really kind of close it out, I think there's one other thing that should be mentioned too, and I think that it's sort of important, is that just because people think or say that they trust Fox News more, it doesn't actually mean that they're right. Now, we know for a fact that people who watch Fox News are actually misinformed. They're more misinformed than they are actually informed. And I think Colbert had a word for that, for what Fox News does, and he called it truthiness. And I think we'll end on that and go to the next segment.
Do you mean that we'll lean forward to the next segment?
You're terrible, sir. You're a terrible person. And what was that? What was with that? Hitler-esque lean forward. Like what was that supposed to be?
It's the South Park overemphasis. Lean forward.
Jeez. All right, so. Anyway, Gomer, we're going to have some fun with this guy. Now, recently, the House Judiciary Committee had a hearing about religious freedom. Okay, well, that's fascinating. I'm curious as to why we need a hearing on religious liberty. Maybe it has something to do with the Hobby Lobby case being decided in the Supreme Court. Now, their hearing arguments, of course, started probably at the end of last month. So the Judiciary Committee is having this hearing, and one of the speakers happens to be a man named Barry Lynn. Now, he's the executive director for Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. Now, Representative Louis Gohmert is on the House Judiciary Committee, So he was present for this meeting, and he had a question for Mr. Barry Lynn. So I'm going to go to that.
I'm curious, in your Christian beliefs, do you believe in sharing the good news that will keep people from going to hell, consistent with the Christian beliefs?
Yes, I'm happy to. When I speak to...
Okay, so you don't believe somebody would go to hell if they do not believe Jesus is the way, the truth, the life?
I personally do not believe people go to hell because they don't believe in a specific set of ideas in Christianity.
No, not a set of ideas. Either you believe as a Christian that Jesus is the way, the truth, the life, or you don't. And there's nothing wrong in our country with that. There's no crime. There's no shame. It should never be a law against those beliefs. And that's what we want to maintain, is people's chance to elect yes or no.
Congressman, what I believe is not necessarily what I think ought to justify the creation of public policy for everybody, for the 2,000 different religions that exist in this country, the 25 million non-believers. I've never been offended. I've never been afraid to share my belief. When I spoke recently at an American atheist conference, it was clear from the very beginning in the first sentence that I was a Christian minister. I was there to talk to them about the preservation of the Constitution. And in fact, I said, you know, we can debate the issue of the existence of God for another 2,000 years. I want to preserve the Constitution and its effect on all people, believers and not believers, in the next 5 years. We could have a very interesting discussion sometime, probably not in a congressional hearing.
Well, I was just trying to figure out, when you say
scriptural
Christian
passages.
All right, so this is what Louis Gohmert thinks is important enough to bring up in a congressional hearing. So, okay, so this isn't anything super egregious on Louis' part. He thinks he's a Christian, and okay, that's fine. But what I really liked about this discussion is what Pastor Lynn had said. What I believe is not necessarily what I think ought to justify the creation of public policy for everybody. And that's that's really the difference here. Now, you have people like Louis Gohmert, Ted Cruz, Michelle Bachmann, and many more like them that do see their beliefs as a justification for making public policy. It's because they don't really believe in the separation of church and state. But take Hobby Lobby for an example. They're a corporation that doesn't want their insurance that they offer to their employees to cover emergency contraceptions, right? Because they feel it violates their religious beliefs. Now, the Washington Post explains. The question these cases are seeking to solve is whether for-profit companies have a right to exercise religious freedom under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a federal law passed in 1993 that states that the government shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a rule of general applicability. So if Hobby Lobby gets a win on the Supreme Court, that would be an example of public policy based on religious belief, something Louis Gohmert would probably definitely agree with. And that brings up another issue that's somewhat related to this, is the idea that corporations are people with First Amendment rights, something a lot of Republicans also agree with. So back to Gohmert and why he's talking about Jesus during a congressional hearing. Now, I said before that he doesn't believe in the separation of church and state. But if you ask him, he might actually say something a little bit different. And for this, I go to a raw story. Now, this was on the separation of church and state as described by Louis Gohmert in a video. He said, quote, but it was to be a one-way wall, where the state would not dictate to a church, but the church would certainly play a role in the state. So that's a little different idea than a lot of people have about the separation of church and state now. So this is what they believe, man, that Christian religion should rule America. They want us to be like Iran, American Sharia law. But instead of Islamic law, it'd be Christian law. So people like Gohmert, personally to me, I think that the people like Gohmert are dangerous and they hold significant power. And I think that's a major problem. What do you guys think about this? We'll start with you.
Okay.
I think, Stephen, go ahead. You go first, man. You were wanting to chime in there.
Well, I mean, first of all, in regards to what the pastor said there, the fact he had to refer to him as congressman, like, and give Louis Gohmert any sort of respect is beyond me. And then when Louis said, it's not wrong at all for for this country if you have different religious beliefs and stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with our country having people celebrate different religious beliefs. But the tone of his voice and the manner in which he phrased it is almost like, there's nothing wrong in you kind of in the country allowing that, but there's something wrong with you in believing that. And the very fact that the problem with a lot of the people like Louis Gohmert and those sorts of kind of Christian extremist mindsets is they see separation of church and state, and they see that as there should be a separation so that the state cannot interfere with the church. Like they see it as they imagine it as a one-way system of kind of like being able to block things, and that's not the case. There's no comma in that sentence. It's absolutely ridiculous and egregious things. No, of course he wants to basically start up a Christianity or Christian caliphate in kind of the states that we represent. It's unbelievable. I mean, fair credit to the pastor and just saying, no, it doesn't matter what I believe. My beliefs shouldn't, no one's beliefs at all should influence kind of how policy is formed. Policy should be based on facts. And I give full credit to that pastor for standing, and it doesn't take a lot to stand up to Louis Gohmert and saying, no, you're an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about.
All right, Sean, go ahead.
Oh, and I was going to say, it's basically impossible to have a separation of church and state if it only goes one way. Because if the dominant church can influence government policy, then won't they use that influence to influence over the other churches, the less dominant churches? Like, it doesn't, like, his theory on the separation of church and state is ridiculous. And like, it's nobody's saying that you can't have your beliefs and that can't lead you to a moral foundation, and you can't enact laws based on that moral foundation. But you can't enact laws that promote a specific religion or a specific religious agenda. Like, it's not that hard to figure out, and the relationship is beneficial for both the church and the state. Like, each are, if they're separate institutions, it's not like it's a negative for the church to not be influenced by the government, or it's a negative for the government not to be influenced by the church. It benefits both. It lets our societies function more like efficiently, for one thing. Like, it's just, Louis Gohmert is such a fool, and I'm glad he's a congressman for one reason, because he used to be a judge, which means he used to rule on cases. So I'm glad he's an irrelevant member of Congress, and probably the dumbest member of Congress.
All right, Jordan, we'll get your words in, and if there's anything we need to discuss here, we should. If not, we'll move on. Jordan, go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to echo a lot of what's been said and kind of expound on it. Bravo to Reverend Lynn for pointing out, I mean, there's a sad irony here that has to be balanced with the fact that I'm glad to see someone say it, but what we have is a man of the cloth telling the congressman, the United States government official, to stop trying to be a pastor and start being a legislator. And the congressman telling the pastor to stop trying to be a pastor and try to be a legislator. Like, it's ridiculous. And to Sean's point, yeah, not only, I mean, Sean points out the obvious logical fallacy in Gohmert's understanding of separation of church and state, but there's also, I mean, the history backs it up. One reason why the separation of church and state was so important in the early days in the founding of our nation was because the crown that we rebelled against, England, had a state church. They still have a state church. And the great irony here is, of the four of us, the Brit in the room is not a member of the Church of England, but I am, by way of the Anglican Church in North America. So yeah, so that was one reason why the separation of church and state was so important, was because it was, Anglicanism and the church, quote unquote, was associated with the crown that our nation had rebelled against. And so yeah, there was a history. There's a lot of bloodshed in England, from Cromwell all the way up to Elizabeth, over going back and forth between which state the church favored, or which church the state favored, excuse me. And there's a lot of history of whenever you don't have a separation of church and state, the big church running roughshod over the other churches. And that's just within the Christian context. That's not even, talking about a society that's anywhere near as pluralistic as ours is, where so many different people and so many different religions, so many different groups have to be represented and be treated fairly. So yeah, Gomer's idea is just idiotic. And then one point, I really hate it whenever people have to get on a soapbox anytime a story is remotely related to something. But I have to get on my projection soapbox here, man. Like whenever conservatives get up in arms about Sharia law and people trying to impose theocracy in America, that's because they're trying to do it. That's why they feel so threatened, because it's what they're doing. And they want it to happen, but they want it to be their religion and not somebody else's. And that's just totally what's going on here. And finally, I guess you could say, because of the events of today and how out of hand things have gotten, a congressional hearing on separation of church and state could be something within the right context that maybe the country needs. However, not just a member of the government, but somebody who holds a pretty big position in the government, like Louis Gohmert, asking a pastor about what he believes happens to the unevangelized or people who don't know Jesus, that's not the kind of thing that is supposed to happen in the halls of Congress. I had to write a paper about that as a freshman in my Intro to Missions class because I was a Christian Studies major. That's where that conversation happens. That's not something that's supposed to happen in the halls of government. That's not a governmental question. It's not even a really, really important question, theologically speaking. So why are you wasting taxpayers' time doing it, and why are you making it so central to the way you form laws for 300 million people? It's ridiculous, man.
All right, so my final point to sort of close this out is like I said, people like Gohmert, they are dangerous, and they do hold a significant power. I disagree that he's an irrelevant congressman, because he has a lot of appointments and a lot of really important committees. So that's that's a major issue for for America. So and the final point to make is that if you want that to change, you have to do something about it. And the thing that you can do, man, is if you're in Texas, man, get out and vote. There are progressives in Texas. There's liberals in Texas, man, and pretty soon, the demographics are going to change. And if you want to get people like Louis Gohmert out of office, man, go out and vote. Just vote.
Wait, Jeff, are you saying that Arabs should learn Spanish in Mexico and sneak over the border to vote against Louis Gohmert?
I'm not. I do not.
That's one of that. To clarify, that's one of Louis Gohmert's conspiracy theories. I'm clarifying for our audience, but I
know, right? But like I said, that conspiracy theory, I've heard it before, and it's insanity.
But I want to drop one final point of irony in this story, is that the Constitution says that there could be no religious tests for public office, and Louis Gohmert was I realized that guy was just a witness in the hearing, but Louis Gohmert was asking him basically how Christian you were, as if that is what qualifies you to be in that room. And the one final point is, a hearing necessarily on the separation of church and state is not a bad thing, right? Because it is a part of our law, and certain laws, like the Hobby Lobby case, has a little bit of nuance in it. They're not 100% anti-birth control in theory. They're anti-specific methods. So that in theory makes sense, but don't ask questions that seem like you're administering a religious test to the witness, who is a pastor.
Right. It just seems like a waste of time to me to sit there and debate religion in Congress. But anyway, we're gonna move on. Talk about the pressing news, or if you're Eric Cantor, depressing news of the election, the blowout election, and the toppling of Eric Cantor, and the election of Dave Brat, or Brat, whatever you want to call it. Establishment media is on fire about Eric Cantor. Cantor, of course, famous as a member of the Young Guns and House Majority Leader. Now, we've got a little bit of news on that and some analysis. So let's cover what we know really quick. Now, Cantor faced off against challenger Dave Brat. And let's go to a video here.
Because Eric Cantor last night was one of the most powerful politicians in America, one of the top Republicans in America. Listen to him here. You know, he just lost.
Obviously, we came up short. It's disappointing, sure, but I believe in this country.
The winner, an economics professor named Dave Brat, who now, last night, 7 o'clock was an unknown. Now he is a Tea Party national hero. Listen.
It's not about Dave Brat winning tonight. It's about returning the country to constitutional principles.
Okay, so who is Dave Brat? Now, there have been a lot of articles about him lately, so let's start with some of the basics. Now, Brat is an economics professor at Randolph-Macon College, and that's Ashland, Virginia. Okay, so immediately everybody's thinking, okay, he's an economics guy. He knows his shit. Now, but if we can remember, another supposed economic guru, like Paul Ryan, was supposed to be just that, a budget guru. And his plan didn't even balance the budget. Like Paul Ryan, Brat reportedly has some ties to Randian philosophy, having written a paper titled An Analysis of the Moral Foundations in Ayn Rand. Now, he has been referred to as the Tea Party challenger. And that's right, but it's also wrong. Let me explain. According to the Wall Street Journal, he never actually identified as Tea Party, and the National Tea Party movement refused to fund him. Now, he did get some local Tea Party support in Virginia, but nationally, none of the Tea Party groups really wanted anything to do with him. Not only that, but outside groups also spent heavily against Brat. For example, the NRA. The American Chemistry Council and the National Association of Realtors and other large groups poured a ton of money into this race on the side of Eric Cantor. Cantor himself spent about $1 million. Now, I think that's sort of why Washington is crapping their pants over this, because of the amount of money spent in the race. The people with more money expected an easy win, because that's what normally happens. So a little bit more on Dave Brat. Now, Brat is more of a libertarian-leaning conservative. So obviously he's against Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, and he was recently talking with Chuck Todd about the minimum wage. And he simply responded that, I'm a free market guy. Well, okay. Well, there's your answer on that. Now, Mother Jones dived into some of his positions a little bit deeper. He wants to cut Social Security payments by 2/3, something that Sean actually advocates, since he does like to point out how Social Security recipients currently receive 3 times as much benefits paid out as they paid in. Okay, well, that will sure get him the senior vote. He's for cutting education. That's not a surprise. He's for dissolving the IRS. That's to be expected perfectly. He's also not worried about climate change, since rich countries solve their problems. Yes, rich countries solve their problems. Poor countries? Fuck them. Who cares? Speaking of the rest of the world, he is against the UN, and his campaign actually came out hard against amnesty for the 11 million estimated undocumented immigrants living and working in the United States, and is, of course, against immigration reform. Now, Dave Brat is a bit of a mixed bag, at least in my case. Now, I've outlined a lot of negative things, but there is something interesting that I did find. Now, there is a piece in the Republic Report by Lee Fang about Dave Bratt, and it leads with this quote. Quote, all of the investment banks up in New York and D.C., they should have gone to jail. Now, wait a minute here. Now, that's not a quote from Elizabeth Warren, right? That's Dave Bratt. And it's a surprise that no one else in the corporate media is actually talking about that. Now, that's interesting. In fact, the article kind of points that out. Quote, the national media is buzzing about Bratt's victory, but for all the wrong reasons. Now, that's really interesting. Article continues. Republic Report listened to several hours of Bratt's stump speeches and radio appearances, and that issue, immigration, came up far less than what Bratt called the main problem in government, corruption and cronyism. Now, Bratt told internet radio host Flint Engelman that the #1 plank in his campaign is free markets. Makes sense for a libertarian. Bratt went on to explain Eric Cantor and the Republican leadership do not know what a free market is at all. I think we can all agree with that. And the clearest evidence of that is the financial crisis. When I say free markets, I mean no favoritism to K Street lobbyists. Banks like Goldman Sachs were not fined for their role in the financial crisis. Rather, they were rewarded with bailouts. So it's obvious to me why this side of Bratt isn't being talked about at all by the corporate media. Because they love crony capitalism. They love bailouts, and they don't care about corruption unless it fits their side's narrative. Now, as you can probably guess, I've got a bunch of problems with Dave Bratt and a lot of his policies. But you also have to keep it real. Cantor was a 100% complete corporate whore. And I could get into some examples about that, but I think it's been obvious when you look at his record. At least Bratt is giving lip service to things like ending corporate corruption, which has taken over our democracy. So I have to wonder here, and this is a really, really good question, I wonder if that we as progressives who actually care about money in politics and fighting the corruption that's taken over our democracy and ending the crony capitalism, could we find an unlikely ally in Dave Bratt to that end? We may have to see. I'll go to the panel and see what you guys think.
Well, I want to jump in first because I was very happy when Eric Cantor went down, and I was happy when I didn't even know what candidate beat him in the primary. But first thing I want to correct is Social Security. It's Medicare that pays 2/3 more than it takes in. It's not Social Security. But Bratt is kind of he's a mix, but he's closer to an actual Tea Party conservative than anything. Like, I know you said he wasn't supported by any of the national groups, but the national groups are the corporate groups. Like, he was supported by smaller scale like donors. He only spent $100,000 compared to Eric Cantor's $5.5 million. Like, he was a grassroots candidate and he won. And like, he's if you look at his positions, he's pretty good on the NSA. It looks like he's going to be in the Liberty Caucus in Congress with Amash and other Congress people. He's good on in my opinion, he's good on some economic issues. I don't understand why 18 different articles were like an Ayn Rand reader, as if reading a novel, books by a famous novelist is somehow evil. Like, it's like completely ridiculous. But they're like an Ayn Rand, and not to mention Ayn Rand's books are about corruption in government, and the villains are the government and people who use government corruption to get economic advantages. So, like, it's an anti-crony capitalist message, but whatever. So, like, it looks like a decent candidate from a Republican standpoint won this race, and his immigration position, like, it's shitty. I don't like it, but Eric Cantor was shitty on everything, or next to everything, in my opinion. So it's a definite win for the entire United States of America.
I partly agree with that sentiment. I mean, first of all, I mean, he's an economics professor, and as Jeff said, he was being interviewed by Chuck Todd, and he didn't have a position on minimum wage. Now, I can understand some newly elected politicians not having a concrete stance on what the minimum wage should be, but as an economics professor, that's one of the main things you should know about and have an opinion on. And then also, in some of his modules that he taught, he listed the Bible as optional reading and listed God as the author of the Bible, which of course is ridiculous. It was written by man, yada, yada, yada. And then also, he described his victory as a miracle. He's a kind of Catholic sort of guy. And he believes that Nietzsche is a really good way of kind of going forward and kind of pushing the Catholic message out. He seems to be quite a big fan of Nietzsche. Nietzsche, the guy who famously said that God is dead and that Christianity is kind of a slave morality and mentality. He's a subtly stupid man. He's a very kind of intellectual veneer. And if you dig a bit deeper, and you've all pointed out kind of his policy positions, they're all, I think, they're all pretty stupid. He's got one or two good points. But, as Jeff said, getting to the kind of, he seems, there's a potential that he'd be an ally in getting money out of politics in America. And for me, like, my position's slightly evolving now, that it doesn't matter how stupid and insane or ridiculous all the other policies that a politician may have. If they say, look, no, I'm going to push for a constitutional amendment and we'll get money out of politics, that's the one thing that's top of my list. If they say that and they start acting that, I don't care at all what their other policies are, because as soon as money's out of politics, those sort of people will be voted out and will actually get true progressives in. So it doesn't matter what else he believes. As long as he helps get money out of politics, you just have to take the shitty with the kind of the little diamond in the shit and say, yeah, it's good for America.
And I want to push back a little bit. Like, he's not stupid. He didn't want to answer the question on Meet the Press not on Meet the Press, on his interview on the minimum wage. Like, because he's a professor. Like, he doesn't talk in sound bites. You don't want to answer. If your position is no on minimum wage increase, then you don't want to say no. Like, you want to have a longer answer. But if you say no, it's going to be no on minimum wage. So, like, he didn't want to answer that question. The idea that he's an idiot because he did something smart politically is kind of dumb. Like, he is a smart guy. Like, he believes that the banks should have went to jail, right? Because he's all about free market principles. And if you commit fraud, you go to jail. He believes that they shouldn't have gotten bailed out. Like, there's a lot of, like, good stuff in there. Like, I'm pretty happy with him. I'm not, like, I probably wouldn't support him. I don't know if I would, like, get up and go vote for him. But this is the strain of the Tea Party that's more in the Rand Paul line of thinking instead of the Sarah Palin, like, Christine O'Donnell line of thinking. Like, it's a much, or the Louis Gohmert line of thinking. It's a much bigger improvement over Eric Cantor, and I think you're kind of glossing over that.
All right, we're gonna go with Jordan. Jordan?
So I'll ignore Stephen's incredibly oversimplified philosophy of religion and try to stick to the question that Jeff posed, which is, do we have an unlikely ally? Now, Jeff, I realize your question was specifically, I believe, in getting money out of politics, and there we may, because this is obviously a guy who didn't come to power, because of pandering to donors or anything like that. That said, in the greater scheme of things, is he better than Cantor? I don't know if that's the question that we need to be asking. I mean, do we really want to compare? Like, we can't settle for the people running our country to just be horrible and decide, oh, this guy might be slightly less horrible on a couple of issues. The question we need to ask, rather than comparing him to the guy he's replacing, is, from our progressive perspective, is this someone that we think could ultimately be good for America? And the answer here is a resounding no. And the reason I say that is because the fundamental, at its heart, what progressivism is and what conservatism is a disagreement over what government should be. Conservatism, especially maybe we should say libertarianism, believes that government cannot be used as a force for good, is inherently bad, cannot do almost anything right. Libertarians, they have a self-defeating ideology because they will concede that government should do some things, and if government should do some things, then that means there's things government can do, and their philosophy falls apart, but we'll leave that alone for now. But anyway, progressives believe that whenever government is functioning the way it's supposed to be, that not only can it be a good thing, but it has the potential, to be one of the most effective ways to accomplish something. And so that whole big, long, convoluted lead-in was for this point. One of Cantor's greatest hits when he was in office was back during the government shutdown, the big one that lasted forever. I don't know if you guys remember. I don't know if we covered this or not. But we got to a point where we had the votes to end the government shutdown, and normally you could have, but the Republicans played this game where they set it up that only Cantor could call for the vote to end the shutdown. So the shutdown dragged on long after the democratic process should have allowed it to end. And so as horrible as Cantor is for being a part of that, I just want to point out that oh my gosh, my mind just blanked. That Bratt pointed to Cantor's direct role Cantor's acquiescence and finally allowing that to come to a vote and ending the government shutdown as proof that Cantor had betrayed his conservative values, meaning that the guy who held our country hostage, even though the votes were there to end the shutdown, was not pro-shutdown enough for the guy that's replacing him. So this guy is not good for America. This is not some unlikely ally. We're in for a world of hurt with this cat.
Nonsense. I'm going to go out and say that this guy, if he gets elected to Congress, which he probably will, because I still haven't heard of his Democratic challenger, this guy will be better than 80% of the congressmen, because you can't get there's like how many people in the House of Representatives want to throw Wall Street bankers in jail, want to not bail people out. Like, I don't know if you noticed this, one of Eric Cantor's biggest contributors was the American Realtor Association, because they're pro-housing bailout. Like, they're still paying him off for supporting the bailout. So, like, and his positions on the NSA are good. Like, his positions on foreign intervention are pretty good from what I've seen so far. Like, this guy will be better than 80% of the people in the House of Representatives. And, like, I compare it to probably the way I feel about people on the progressive side that I probably disagree with, like 90% or 80% of their positions. But at least they're coming from, like, an honest position, and that would be a good thing. So, like, I think you guys are, like, way overglossing this. And also, most importantly, down goes Cantor, down goes Cantor, down goes Cantor.
I think we can all agree, at least, on the fact that, thank goodness, somebody toppled Cantor, because he needed to go. Speaking of course, Cantor, continuing with a related segment, basically, how did a no-name like Bratt actually beat Cantor? Now, Dave Bratt beat out Eric Cantor in a recent primary, and of course, everyone has their theories about why that happened. The Democrats are, of course, saying that the Tea Party swooped in to loft him to victory. That's not true, of course. David Wasserman, an analyst at the Nonpartisan Political Report, said of Cantor's loss, quote, part of this plays into his religion. You can't ignore that elephant in the room. Fascinating. All right. Cantor is Jewish, but I'm not exactly buying that. Others say it was his stance on immigration, which may have actually played some role, perhaps even a significant role. Cantor was seen as being in favor of at least talking about immigration reform, and when you might actually signal that you might possibly maybe be in favor of talking about immigration reform, the right wing will say that, of course, that you were in favor of amnesty for all the illegals. And, of course, that's a pretty big talking point. Still others say that it was the money, which isn't true. Cantor outspent Bratt 20-1. The GOP establishment was firmly on the side of Eric Cantor, while Eric Erickson, Laura Ingraham, Mark Levin, and Ann Coulter had endorsed Bratt. So that's really kind of the team of asshole all-stars that were on his side. But what isn't being reported by the corporate media is a story covered by journalist Brad Friedman, who's a friend of the show. Now, before I get into what he had to say, I wanted to point out how the polls were way, way off. Cantor's polling guy, John McLaughlin, and his group forecasted a 34-point win for Eric Cantor. Landslide. I wonder who else predicted a landslide and was way off. Anyway. Now, Brad kind of breaks this down as a question of voting integrity. He writes, the results from 9 different counties and 1 city that make up the impossibly gerrymandered 7th district, which Cantor helped carve out for himself, are all based on the numbers reported by the oft-failed, easily manipulated computer tabulators from the alphabet soup of different types of electronic voting and tabulation systems used in each of the separate jurisdictions that comprise the district. Now, he's not saying that anyone specifically tampered with these devices, but just that the results can't be verified. Continues. All the voting systems used in VA07 have been found by computer scientists and e-voting experts to be vulnerable to error, malfunction, and malfeasance. And whether it's a paper-based system or a 100% unverifiable touchscreen system, each one uses a computerized central tabulator to total up all the numbers from the vulnerable memory cards deployed in the systems at each of the various precincts in the jurisdiction. Now, in his analysis, Brad points out that 8 of the 10 jurisdictions in the 7th district used unverifiable voting methods, basically your touchscreen voting machines that have several different manufacturers and are prone to issues like malfunctions and even vote tampering. Now, I mentioned that Cantor's pollster reported that he had a 34-point lead just before the election. And given that this election is an incredible upset that hasn't had anything like it happen since the 19th century, I think it's pretty healthy to be skeptical and want these votes to be verified. Now, speaking of the results and verification, Friedman writes, those results may be correct, or they may not be. Nobody actually knows. Given the broad reported victory by Bratt in several different counties on several different voting systems, it seems at first glance unlikely that malfunction or malfeasance gave him the edge. Still, nobody actually knows that, as election results, even where they can be verified by human beings, will likely never be. Now, I want to get your guys' thoughts on this. What do you think about this? I mean, is this a good example or a possible example of maybe these unverifiable voting systems? Could there be problems with them?
I mean, we've all seen Hacking Democracy on this show, I assume. If you haven't, oh well, go watch it. So I do know the issues about the voting machines. It just seems very unlikely that the challenger of the House Majority Leader would have some kind of a scam pulled in his favor. It would seem like this would go the other way because, it's usually the powerful that have control of the voting machines. I remember when before the run-up to the Obama election, every progressive ever was reporting that Mitt Romney, through a series of companies, owned one of the electronic voting machine companies. So, it's usually the powerful, the rich and powerful that would theoretically run these machines in their favor. As far as a malfunction, that's definitely possible. And if it gets us to switch back to an actual logical voting system this election, then I'm willing to, and I feel sad saying this, willing to give Eric Cantor back his House seat, if that's the case, because these electronic voting machines, they look like a scam because they're more expensive. There's no way to verify them, and we don't know where they come from or anything like that, and they're so easily hackable. They showed, you don't even have to have the machine. You could just touch the memory card, and that memory card that they used can mess up the whole system without going to the central office. So all the security precautions are bullshit, and you'll find that out if you watch Hacking Democracy. So I would love to get rid of the machines, but I don't think this specific case was a election theft or malfunction. It just doesn't seem logical to me. I think it's low voter turnout, and also the Jewish angle is kind of ridiculous. Like, I didn't even know Eric Cantor was Jewish. I didn't know he was the only Jewish member of the Republican House of Representatives. I know there's Jewish Democrats, but and he was voted in that district for like 14 straight years. Like, what are you talking about? Like, why are we even having this conversation about his Jewishness?
I don't see how that could be an elephant in the room. So that's absolutely fucking ridiculous. But Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with Sean. I mean, first of all, in terms of Mitt Romney having some kind of tenuous link to these sort of voting machines back in 2012, it was his son who had worked for one of the companies. So it was a relatively close link when you look at it. It wasn't a kind of a first removed cousin on his sister's side kind of. So it was a close link. But in terms of this kind of specific issue, I think we're right in saying that it's really unlikely that it would have been kind of. I just don't think that these sort of irregularities. Even then, I think I'm right in saying that Brat won by something like kind of 6,000 votes, and I don't think. And as Sean said, there wasn't particularly high voter turnout, and that helps the more energized base of whatever candidate, and obviously that's more for the Tea Party Libertarian candidates. So that's why he won. Congress has a like 5 or 6% approval rating, so of course he's not going to be popular. And of course, I know that that question shifts when you say, "Oh, what about your own specific candidate representative?" But I think Sean's right that you can't be, in the nature of technology today, you can't have these electronic systems. Absolutely anything is hackable with the right skill. You've got 15, 16-year-old kids, who are able to hack into the CIA website. There was an 18-year-old German student who found a security bug in TweetDeck, which is a kind of quite a large piece of software for Twitter, and he basically kind of completely corrupted all of TweetDeck for a couple of hours. He was like an 18-year-old German university student. So of course there's going to be more skilled technicians. There's going to be professional hackers out there who can get into these machines. If you carry a powerful magnet, I imagine you could maybe wipe a memory card or something. What's wrong with a bit of kind of pen and paper? Like, okay, people could be locked into a courthouse late at night during accounting and fill out all the things, but it's so much harder, I think, to counterfeit paper ballots. And I know people on the right wing will be saying, "Oh, but voter fraud, there's so much voter fraud." Even with these electronic machines, and even with, going back to the pen and paper system, voter fraud isn't a huge amount. And whilst this may be a slightly kind of tenuous point, that until you get money out of politics, for the vast majority, it doesn't matter if you have, I know we've kind of debated it a bit, but it doesn't matter if you have Cantor or Bratt or whatever Republican or Democrat for the most part, 90% of politicians, it really doesn't matter who you vote for. If some of them win by a couple of thousand votes, it just doesn't matter until you sort the entire system out. And once you get money out of politics, then you can focus on having a proper, like, voting system. I know that sounds a bit kind of asked before head, but I think that's really what needs to happen.
All right, Jordan.
Nothing really to say. I think it's it's complete unverified speculation to try to make some conspiracy theory about Cantor not really losing. But at the same time, excellent points. It's just there's too much security risk for anything electronic now. We do need to go a little more low tech on our voting system. I can get behind that.
Right, and I don't think anybody here, and I especially don't think that Brad is at all saying that we have a problem with with malfeasance or anything like that, especially in this result, or trying to make a conspiracy theory out of it. I think he's just trying to make the overall point of look at how unverifiable our system is. We need to fix that so that we can make sure that everybody who votes gets the result that they voted for, and not running into any sort of malfunctions or any sort of issues. Basically, it's trying to make sure that every vote is counted and that every vote matters and is free. It's fairly calculated, and the best way to do that is of course to do the paper system and to have actual people verify it.
Well,
Sean?
yeah, I was gonna say, well, we're never gonna have a society where every vote matters because every vote doesn't matter. But I would like a society where every vote counts. And we're not, like, to be clear, I'm not anti-technology in an election system, but you need a paper, tangible, physical record to double check against. Like, the way these systems work is you vote electronically, and then they print out one receipt, and that's it. Like, you need the actual paper ballots. You can feed them into a machine as long as you have the record of the ballots. Like, it's not that difficult, and we don't have that in a lot of places in this country. Some places have fought and beaten back the voting machines, but like we need to have that. And I like Brad and everything, bradblog.com. So if that's the right website. But yeah, so he should come back on the show. We're not saying that he's bad, but it's good points, even though I don't agree it impacted this election.
Hey, and look, if a paper-based system is good enough for the VA, it should be good enough for voting.
Oh man, that's terrible.
That is terrible.
But no,
every argument we've made this segment just fell apart.
Pretty much. But no, I think this was a good opportunity to at least point out, since it is such a blowout that has made such national news, to use this as a way to start a conversation. Like, hey, this is in the news. By the way, did you know that all these votes are unverified? And this is why. So this is a conversation that he has hoped to start, not a conversation about conspiracy theories and what if he didn't win. That's not the question that he asks in his article. The question that he asks is how many of these are actually verified, and what are we doing about these systems? That's the question, and that's the conversation that I think he intended for us to have when he wrote this article, or for America to have. How much can we trust our voting machines to do their job properly? And I don't think that we can trust our voting machines really at all. So, and that's the conclusion that I come to.
And if you guys are still not convinced, I invite you to watch Hacking Democracy. And if that doesn't convince you, then you should really be careful, because eventually the robots will elect their own robot leaders, and we will be living under their rule.
So if anybody wants to check out the article, it's linked in the description of this video, and it'll also be put up on the description for the YouTube video. So check out that article. It's very, very long. It's very expansive. I was only able to touch on a little bit due to time constraints and everything, but it's worth a read. So with that, I want to go to our final story of the night. So Mark Levin was on Sean Hannity trying to give some advice to Republicans about what not to do in order to win elections.
You look at this election in 2012 of Obama. Obama should have been beaten by a halfway competent presidential candidate in the Republican Party who could articulate the principles of the party and expose Obama's fecklessness and weakness. We didn't do it. Millions of people stayed home. And who are those millions of people? Those were Reagan Democrats. Those are blue-collar Democrats. Stop chasing ethnic groups. Stop chasing genitalia. Talk to the American people. Talk about liberty, opportunity. Explain to them that Obama is wrong and that we need to unleash the American people and unleash the economy.
You know, you might be making news with that genitalia remark, but for those that don't know you, don't know your sense of humor.
Yes, sense of humor. And yes, let's only go after white men. Stop trying to appeal to minorities and women. Women. We don't have anything in common with them anyway. Who cares about them? Minorities? Why do we have to appeal to minorities? It's too much work to make them think that we actually give a shit about them and create policy that actually helps them. Look, that's the message of Mark Levin and pretty much the entire Republican Party at this point. Their outreach, in my opinion, has failed. Now, if you can remember, after the 2012 election, The RNC came up with an autopsy list to see where they went wrong with the voters. Now, TPM, Talking Points Memo, compiled a list of highlights from that autopsy, so I'm going to list a couple of those. Something that would help would be to pass immigration reform. Number 2 would be to listen to minorities. Move a little to the left on gay issues. Basically in order to stop scaring off other groups of voters. They didn't say that they wanted to be okay with gay marriage, just to stop hating them as much. Another thing, stop blocking out all dissenting voices in the party. Now, there's a term for this, and it's called epistemic closure. And the autopsy confirmed that the GOP is currently suffering from that. It's basically creating an echo chamber, getting rid of all the people who might have little disagreements, and basically talk to yourself. And another thing is to stop being the party of the rich. Well, don't worry, Mark. The GOP is about 0-5 on that list. So you know there was part of that interview that we didn't show, and it was when they brought up Reagan. And Hannity was like, well, everybody loves Reagan. Well, I mean, of course, how could you not like the Gipper? I mean, he raised taxes like 11 times, sold weapons to Iran, and funded the Contras. What's not to like? The truth is, the Republican version of Reagan is a lot like the version of Jesus, and it's not at all what they were actually like. Now, the reason I mentioned Reagan too was because this autopsy also mentioned that maybe they shouldn't idolize Reagan so much, or at least bring him up all the time. Quote, Ronald Reagan is a Republican hero and role model who was first elected 33 years ago, meaning no one under the age of 51 today was old enough to vote for Reagan when he first ran for president. It's no wonder that Republican policies can seem stale. They're very nearly identical to those offered up by the Republican Party more than 30 years ago. And you pretty much nailed it there. Those policies not only are just nearly identical, but in some cases they're even worse. So Mark Levin is like, don't worry, we got to focus on those Reagan Democrats and get them to vote for a true conservative. Well, Mark, in response to that, I say that we already have a Reagan Democrat in office. His name is Barack Obama. Thoughts?
Well, I've got to jump in first. Mark Levin, he almost wants to, he's trying to encourage as many establishment Republicans to sign a suicide pact with him, so the Republican Party in its entirety goes into a downward spiral. Doesn't want immigration, doesn't want to support gays, wants more wars. He recently said earlier today, with all the chaos that's going on in Iraq in a moment, because we don't want Iraq to fail, we should send over our bombers and quote, kill the cockroaches. Doesn't want boots on the ground, he said, but he just wants to go and bomb everything over there. He's such a painfully stupid man that, like, surely he must see the polls. He must see the polls. It's part of his job. He should be seeing the polls that says vast majority of Americans are in favor of some form of immigration reform, at least to some extent. Majority of Republicans, you know, we said in an earlier segment, at least those who don't watch Fox News, they think that immigrants, you know, are a boon to the country. They help the country in many different aspects. It's just, I can't... If people start going down Mark Levin's kind of roadmap for the Conservative Party, if people start paying more attention to him, which they shouldn't, it's a death knell for the Republican Party, at least the core. There'll be libertarians and then they'll shift off and, you know, maybe have a breakaway party. But Mark Levin's idea of what the country is at the moment is so out of touch and out of sync with reality. It's just unbelievable. I don't know. The problem is he seems to be one of these people that, unlike Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly, they say stuff, but they don't necessarily mean it. He seems to genuinely believe what he says, and that's a real problem, because what he says is fucking insanity.
All right, Sean, weigh in.
I think that Sean Hannity might have been right. That genitalia mark did receive a lot of media coverage in this particular instance. Like, if we didn't know Mark Levin and we didn't know his like history and all that stuff, we would have just like what he said is really a crude way of saying if this was a different person, of saying don't pander to certain groups, articulate your message better, right? Which is perfectly fine. But then he talks about like going after the Reagan Democrats who are like dead and old and dead and like all this other stuff. And the way like he says it, it's more the way he said it, not exactly what he said. Because if you break down what he said, it's really not that bad. It's just like if he's like stop pandering and like articulate your message. But the thing is, the Republican Party isn't even trying to go to minorities or women like that much. So like they're not pandering. Like I can understand in a different context how his message is not that bad, is what I'm trying to say, but like it's Mark Levine, so we kind of know where he's coming from.
All right, Jordan.
Yeah, I
what do you
mean,
think? Oh, go ahead, Stephen. Sorry.
I was just going to quickly say, it's almost like, I mean, with the genitalia thing, Sean Hannity was saying that, oh, they don't understand your humour. He wasn't smiling or kidding when he said that. He probably refers to, or at least thinks of women just as genitalia. He doesn't care about minorities. He just wants to stick his head in the sand, and the Republican Party stick its head in the sand, and just don't think about them, keep them out of sight, out of mind. We can still win elections without them. He's wrong. He's just damn wrong.
All right, Jordan.
Yeah. So what's funny is, on a serious note, Sean's right. What he said really isn't horrible. What I kind of got from it was he was saying focus on our conservative principles, conservative values. Let's preach what we actually believe, and that will bring people in. So in that instance, not so bad. Where it is bad on a serious note, though, is he mentioned Reagan Democrats. Well, the thing is, Reagan Republicans, at least Reagan Republicans who held the same views then, or Reagan Republicans, if they held the same views then, I should say, would be too liberal for the Republican Party now, much less Reagan Democrats back then. Now, obviously, these Reagan Republicans are still around, but their views have shifted, and they've become, more and more just bunkered into and sequestered into this far right ideology. But yeah, he's calling for something that's way more liberal than what he thinks he's calling for. But then, on a lighter note, what he said is absolutely, or isn't bad, I should say. What he said isn't bad because it doesn't make any sense, right? Like someone should explain to Mark that genitalia is a gender-neutral term. Like men have genitalia. So
he wants to appeal to a lot of dicks.
But to say like, if you should say, if you want to take this the way a lot of people are taking it and saying we should continue to focus on men, not focus on women, that's still technically chasing genitalia because everyone has genitalia, with a few exceptions that we don't have to get into. There's a whole lot of nonsense here, and I mean, it sucks because if this came from a less despicable person, this is the kind of like conversation that could actually be good for the country. Like, if we could have a genuine progressive versus genuine conservative debate, like what I feel we have on this show with whenever Sean's here to kind of push back against us, like that's really good because the truth be told, the other side has some good ideas every now and then, and it's good to get those good ideas that we might have missed otherwise. But that's not what we have, and that's certainly not what Mark Levine wants. And it's pathetic. He's an imbecile.
Yeah, I mean, I have two final quick points, and one more serious than the other. The first one is that Mark Levine, he's basically saying, let's focus on our base, let's get those those Reagan Democrats, because he thinks that they're somehow part of his base. If you've lost the last two national elections, trying to clamp down more on your base isn't going to mean that you're going to win any more elections. You've got to expand. You've got to expand to get more people to win the election. If they were the Democrats, if they'd won the last 2 or 3 elections and he said, no, we're going to clamp down on our base, then fine. That's a slightly rational strategy to have. And secondly, just in kind of terms of, you kind of referenced it, don't go after the genitalia. Well, no, he wants to go after the genitalia. He wants to go after all the dicks and pussies that are kind of the gun-wielding, kind of insane people on the right-wing party. But that's a genitalia that he does want to go after. Let's be honest.
Well, I mean,
and you know, as far as his wanting to, you know, win elections and everything like that, you're not going to do that. Like, the Republican Party actually has to start going after people who are, you know, minorities and things like that, because they're a shrinking minority. They're not going to win any elections, especially now with the demographics changing. I mean, Texas is pretty close to turning, by the time 2016 rolls around, it's going to be probably purple. Okay, and so the Republican Party has to expand, and we've talked about this numerous times. It actually has to start reaching out. And people like Mark Levin, they're like, nope, let's stop reaching out, guys. Let's only focus on white men, because that's our demographic. That's who we do well with, and it's true. They do well with white men.
And like, I don't know why I'm being like super fair to Mark Levin for no reason, but like, if you really break down what he said, what he calls Reagan Democrats are just blue collar workers that work Democratic, right? And like, forget about the 2008 election, because like the economy crashed under a Republican. McCain was done, right? But in 2012, they ran a Wall Street guy, Mitt Romney, when they really shouldn't have. So if he's saying that they shouldn't have run a candidate like Romney, that makes sense too. And if he's saying that don't get into a debate over women's genitalia because you're going to lose, that also makes sense, because the war on women was a disaster for the Republicans. Like, every time they talked about a vagina, they fucked up. So, like, in reality, this is Mark Levin using outrageous terms to get us to talk about it, so more people will listen to his radio show. But if you break down the actual, like, substance of what he said, like, you lose if you talk about reproductive rights and you're a Republican. Like, you lose because you're bad at it. Like, there's a difference between being pro-life and being a nut job, right? Like, there's no reason that the Republicans needed to be nut jobs. And you lose if you don't appeal to blue-collar workers. Like, whether the Reagan Democrat thing is relevant or not, which it isn't relevant, like, it's blue-collar workers is what he was trying to say.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm buying that. I'm totally not going to be fair to Mark Levin at all. I just think he does not want the Republican Party chasing after minorities and appealing to women. I should say he doesn't want the Republican Party appealing to women and minorities simply because of the fact that they don't care about them. That they have this, I mean, they have this strategy that's worked for them really well, and they want to keep on pushing it and milking it for as long as they can. Those on the fringe right, they've made a whole campaign out of, you know, challenging women's reproductive rights, going after those, you know, and demonizing minorities. Jordan, you have something?
No, I mean, I hate to say it. God, it hurts to say this. Sean's right. I wanted to say this earlier whenever Stephen made a point, but just because of the delay, I didn't want to jump in the middle of Stephen's sentence. He was not saying that he thinks that Reagan Democrats are his base. What he's saying is and he's got a point. Not that Reagan actually embodied this, but the man was an actor. He could get up there and speak. And he talked about freedom, and he literally kissed the American flag, and there's pictures of it. He did all these things that appealed to moderates, and that's why the term Reagan Democrat, came to be. And it energized people to come vote, not only that wouldn't have normally voted, but if they did vote, wouldn't have voted Republican, voted for Reagan. And that's what he's saying. That these concepts like freedom, liberty, all these buzz, that have been reduced to buzz phrases and just, pointless, talking points. He's saying if we focus on that, then we will bring in some of these moderates. Now it has been brought up that the blue-collar workforce in America is not as big as it was whenever Reagan was around. I believe someone on the YouTube comments has mentioned that, so I would love to see Mark respond to that point, but that's what he was getting at. He's not saying that we need to continue to focus on energizing our base. What he's saying is that these principles and ideals are maybe not universal, but appeal beyond the base on their own. And we don't need to try to target women because Democrats try to target women. So if we just try to do what the Democrats are already doing, then we're not going to win anybody over because that sector is already locked down. He's saying hit the things that, were people who are undecided about or whatever or could jump ship on, hit those. Because if you've got two parties, that are you line up on the less important stuff or the less mainstream stuff, then it's not going to change anybody over because they were already there to begin with. So Sean's right there. Again, we're giving Mark way too much credit. He's not nearly as good a person as we're trying to make him out to be, but we're just, trying to interact with what he said, I guess, rather than who he is.
And here's the problem with that. You guys are actually rational and making good points for him that I don't necessarily buy that he intended to make. I think you guys are taking what he said and actually saying, hey, you could have a good argument, but I don't think that's necessarily what he was saying.
No, I think Mark Levin is the bad guy, right? And I think that you, Jeff, and all your liberal buddies know that he's a bad guy, so every once in a while you guys like to cut out statements that they make, and sometimes their statements aren't as controversial as they seem on the surface, and that's why I'm getting into this. I'm not saying Mark Levin is a good guy or a great guy or anything. He's a shitty guy who says shitty things all the time. I just think this is kind of the least shitty. It's just not politically correct. He used outrageous words, but what he actually said wasn't that bad.
No. See, I'm not focusing on his words. I'm focusing on what I think is his meaning. To stop trying to go, to stop trying to do policies or propose policies that he basically says, GOP, don't focus on women. Okay, don't focus on women's rights. Keep attacking women's rights. Keep, don't care about minorities. Focus on the white conservative. What he makes the point about Reagan Democrats. Reagan Democrats are people who are maybe socially more, more socially liberal, but conservative, fiscally conservative, right? So he wants to appeal to those people on the fiscal conservatism, which the GOP is not at all fiscally conservative, and you have to understand that, right? There's nothing that they do that's actually fiscally conservative. They cut taxes and don't find ways to pay for it, and all their different plans come up with not being even close to being revenue neutral. They cause even more deficits. And I'm not saying that the Democrats are much better, but this is the people that they're trying to steal away. But they're not going to steal people away from the Democrats, because what the Republicans are now, or I'm sorry, what the Democrats are now, are what the Republicans used to be when they were, when you had Reagan as the president. Which means the Republicans have moved so far to the right that they have become insane. So there's no way they'll be able to court the Reagan Democrats, if there is such a thing anymore.
Well, this is I think really what Mark Levin has shown, and whether he intended to show it is a different matter. I don't think he did, because he's a painfully stupid man. But the dilemma for the Republican Party is that, as Levin said, there's no point, if we take kind of Sean and Jordan's point, that there's no point going after kind of the women vote or the minority vote, because the Democrats, they already do that better, so there's no point going that. We should focus on our base. But the problem is, if you don't go after the minority vote and the women vote, then you're not going to win a national election. And they're stuck between the two things, because they should be doing, or should be chasing what a certain group of people, certain groups of people, but the problem they have is they're shit at chasing after those groups of people, and they're just torn. I mean, it's almost like, I feel like kind of summing up Gene Wilder and just saying, if they follow either of those two paths, you lose, you get nothing, and that's the problem that they have. They're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Right.
Because they spent most of their time alienating those two groups.
Right, and I'm not saying it's a good strategy. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that it would be a good strategy for the Republican Party to ignore women. I'm just saying it would be a good strategy for them to not talk about women's lady parts, their genitalia. It is a disaster every time they do it. If that was his point, which I'm not saying that it is, but it could have been, that they shouldn't actually talk about women or about lady parts, then yeah, then he is right on that. But he could have very easily been saying, don't appeal to women or don't make outreach to women. Like, it's either or, but he used the word genitalia. That's why I'm giving him a tiny bit of benefit of the doubt, because I might be the fairest libertarian in the entire world, because I really don't like Mark Levin at all. But I'm being super fair to him.
Right. All right. Final points, guys. Anybody have anything? Jordan.
Yeah,
Take us home.
I've got the final point here. I'll take us home. So, what we take away from this story is that Megyn Kelly killed an intern, and Mark Levin doesn't have genitalia because he doesn't realize that men have genitalia. That's the irrefutable truth that I take away from this segment.
Interesting. All right. That's all we have here on TYT Community, the News and Politics Hour tonight. I want to thank everybody in the live stream for watching and commenting. Appreciate you guys watching the show all the time. It's awesome. Make sure, if you haven't, like and share our clips and stuff like that, and totally appreciate it. I want to thank the patrons, of course, for helping out with the show, keeping us financially, I can't say afloat at this point yet. I'm still sinking. But nonetheless, thank you guys for your contributions and helping out the show. Thank you to our panelists for volunteering to make the show every night. You guys, love you guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
I hate you, Sean.
Oh, damn.
Oh.
Hey, Jeff, how do people in our audience get on the panel?
Leave a message on our Facebook page. You can go to facebook.com/TYTNation or TYT Community and leave a message there. Leave a post if you're interested in being on the panel, or you can email me, jeffw@tytnetwork.com, or you can tweet me at Jeff's Politics or at TYT Community. So if you want to get on the show, just send me a message. Some of our viewers have actually done that. So I believe that's how Nick got on the show, who's watching tonight. Nick, good luck with your studies, man, and your tests. Best of luck to you.
Nerd.
Nerd. Shut up. So, like I said, thank you guys. Make sure to tune in tomorrow when I'm hosting the Social Justice Hour in place of Rhiannon Avenine. We're going to have some excellent social justice stories. So make sure to join us. We'll have Dan Spearin from Truth Mashup joining us as well. It's going to be a fun show. Going to be a lot of great stories. And by great stories, I mean they're going to be depressing. So tune in. So for that, I am Jeff Waldorf. Thank you for tuning in to TYT Community, the News and Politics Hour, and we will see you tomorrow night. Say goodbye, everybody.
Good night. God bless.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye. It's all blessed.